Camp Hearn, Texas, July 1944. The marquee glowed against the evening sky, the Rialto Theater on Main Street, its lights spelling out Casablanca in bulbs that seemed impossibly bright after years of European blackouts. 12 German women stood on the sidewalk in civilian dresses, borrowed from the camp supply, staring at the entrance where American civilians moved freely, purchasing tickets, laughing, living ordinary lives in a nation untouched by bombing or invasion. The women had been nurses in North Africa, had been captured and transported across an ocean, had been told that American captivity meant harsh treatment and deprivation. Instead, an American sergeant was handing them movie tickets and speaking words that seemed impossible. You re-allowed to go in. You're allowed to watch. You're allowed to sit with regular people and pretend for 2 hours that you're not prisoners at all. Greta Hoffmann had been a surgical nurse in Hamburg before the regime had conscripted medical personnel for military service. She had worked in civilian hospitals, had treated accident victims and illness, had chosen nursing because she wanted to help people heal. The military had taken that choice and transformed it into obligation serve in field hospitals or face consequences that the regime didn't specify, but everyone understood meant severe punishment. She had been assigned to a medical unit in North Africa, following Rommel's forces across desert that seemed designed to destroy both equipment and human endurance. The work had been endless, treating combat wounds, managing infections in heat that promoted bacterial growth, performing surgeries in tents where sand got into everything and sterility was aspirational rather than achievable. The other women in her unit had similar stories. Ilse Weber had been a pediatric nurse from Berlin. Marguerite Klein had worked in obstetrics in Munich. Anna Schmidt had been training in general medicine when conscription had interrupted her education. All of them had been pulled from civilian practice, given minimal military training, and shipped to North Africa to support forces that were, even then, beginning their long retreat. The capture had been almost anticlimactic. Their field hospital had been overrun by British forces, advancing faster than German units could retreat. The British had processed them, efficiently verified they were medical personnel, separated them from combat prisoners, treated them according to Geneva Convention protocols that protected medical staff even during wartime. Then came the transfer to American custody. More processing, more questioning, more verification of status and roles. The British had been correct but distant professional captors who followed rules without particular warmth. The Americans were different. Friendlier, more casual, seemingly less concerned with maintaining formal distance between prisoners and guards. The women had been transported to America by ship, crossing the Atlantic in converted cargo holds that were crowded but adequately provisioned. Greta had spent most of that voyage on deck when permitted watching ocean that seemed infinite, trying to process the reality that she was being taken to America, a nation that propaganda had described as weak and crumbling and on the verge of collapse. The propaganda had been obviously false even before the ship docked. American vessels filled the port's cargo ships and warships, and vessels of types Greta couldn't identify, all moving with organized purpose that spoke to industrial capacity Germany had never possessed. The harbor infrastructure was intact, unbombed, functioning with efficiency that made the chaos of German ports seem primitive by comparison. Camp Hearn sat in Texas countryside that was flat and vast and overwhelmingly hot. The camp had been built to house German prisoners, primarily men captured in North Africa and Sicily, with separate sections for the handful of women who had been taken as medical or auxiliary personnel. The women's section was smaller, cleaner, with American female guards who maintained professional distance, but weren't hostile or cruel. The barracks were adequate. Wooden buildings with screens on windows to keep out mosquitoes, fans that moved air without cooling it, bunks that were narrow but had mattresses and clean linens. The food was good, better than what Greta had eaten during her year in North Africa, better even than what she remembered from peacetime Hamburg, where rationing had started before the war officially began. But it was still captivity. Wire fences, guard towers, regulations about where prisoners could go and when. The American guards were fair, but firm rules were enforced, boundaries were maintained, and despite decent treatment, the women were reminded daily that they were prisoners of war, enemy nationals who had been captured serving military forces that had committed terrible acts. Greta had struggled with that designation. She was a nurse. She had treated wounded soldiers regardless of side, had even treated American prisoners who had been brought to her field hospital, had given them the same care she gave German casualties, because medical ethics required treating all patients equally. But to the Americans, she was still enemy personnel, still technically part of military forces that had invaded other nations and caused immense suffering. The work assignments at Camp Hearn were light compared to military service. The women helped in the camp hospital, treating prisoners who became sick or injured. They assisted with laundry and food preparation, not as punishment, but as part of keeping the camp functioning. The work was neither difficult nor demeaning, just basic labor that gave structure to days that might otherwise have been endless stretches of boredom. Evening brought free time. The women could read books from the camp library, mostly German texts donated by American organizations, though some American books were available for those learning English. They could write letters home, subject to censorship, but otherwise unrestricted. They could gather in common areas to talk, to play cards, to maintain some semblance of social life, despite the artificial constraints of captivity. 3 months into their imprisonment, the camp commander, Colonel Harrison, a career officer who seemed genuinely committed to following international law regarding prisoner treatment, made an announcement that none of the women quite believed. Prisoners with good behavior records would be permitted supervised trips to the nearby town, not for work details or official business, but for recreation, movies specifically. The Rialto Theater in Hearn had agreed to allow prisoner attendance on specific evenings, with American guards present to maintain security, but otherwise treating the Germans like regular patrons. The announcement had been met with stunned silence. Greta sat with the other women, trying to process what they had been told. Movies, real movies, in an actual theater with civilians, as if they were free people rather than captured enemies. It seemed impossible, a trick or test or some elaborate setup whose purpose they couldn't yet discern. Ilsa voiced what everyone was thinking. Why would they do this? We're prisoners. Why give us this? Colonel Harrison, speaking through a translator, had explained, because the Geneva Convention requires that prisoners be treated with basic human dignity, because recreational opportunities improve morale and reduce disciplinary problems, because you are primarily medical personnel who are captured serving in non-combat roles, and because, the colonel had added with slight smile, it costs us very little to allow you to watch movies, and denying such simple pleasures serves no legitimate military or security purpose. The logic was American, practical, pragmatic, focused on outcomes rather than ideological positions about how enemies should be treated. But it still seemed surreal to women who had been raised under a regime that valued punishment and control over mercy and reasonable accommodation. The first movie night was scheduled for a Saturday in July. The 12 women selected those with best behavior records, those who had caused no problems. Those whom American authorities deemed lowest security risk spent the preceding week in a state of anxious anticipation mixed with disbelief that this was actually happening. They were issued civilian clothing, not new dresses, but donated items from American women in town who had contributed to a program supporting prisoner welfare. The dresses were modest, clean, pressed in styles that were a few years old, but still presentable. Greta received a blue cotton dress with white collar, simple but infinitely better than the gray prisoner uniforms they wore daily. The women helped each other prepare. They washed hair, borrowed what little makeup was available, tried to make themselves look presentable rather than like prisoners who had spent months in institutional captivity. It was strange dressing up for an evening at the movies, as if they were normal women in a normal town preparing for normal social activity, rather than enemy prisoners about to be escorted to a theater by armed guards. Marguerite stood before a small mirror, adjusting her borrowed dress, and suddenly began crying. Not from sadness exactly, but from the overwhelming cognitive dissonance of preparing for movies while Germany burned, while her family faced who knew what hardships, while the war continued consuming everything she had known. "We shouldn't enjoy this," she said quietly in German. "We shouldn't be going to movies while our people suffer." Greta didn't have good answer. She felt the same guilt, the same sense that accepting American generosity meant betraying German solidarity. But she also understood that refusing wouldn't help anyone in Germany, that her suffering in captivity wouldn't reduce anyone else's suffering, that perhaps accepting mercy when offered was better than insisting on shared misery. "The regime would say this is weakness," Anna observed. "They would say we should resist everything, refuse every comfort, maintain hostility toward our captors no matter how fair they are." "The regime," Ilse replied with bitterness. Greta hadn't heard from her before, left us in a desert with inadequate supplies, and expected us to succeed anyway. "The regime doesn't care about us. Maybe it's time we stopped caring about what the regime would say." The conversation hung heavy in the evening air. They were crossing a line, acknowledging doubts they had been too afraid to voice earlier. The propaganda had taught them that questioning leadership was treasonous, that doubt was weakness, that absolute loyalty was the only acceptable stance. But captivity had given them distance from the regime's immediate control, and distance allowed perspective they hadn't previously permitted themselves. Saturday arrived with Texas heat that made the air shimmer and turned the camp compound into an oven despite the shade. Structures American engineers had built to protect prisoners from worst sun exposure. The women dressed in their borrowed clothing, checked each other's appearance with nervous attention to detail, and gathered at the designated assembly point where Sergeant Miller and 3 other American guards waited to escort them. Miller was young, maybe 25, with the kind of open face that suggested he had grown up in small town, where everyone knew everyone, and suspicion was learned rather than natural. He spoke decent German, learned from grandparents who had immigrated before the previous war, and he treated the German women with courtesy that felt genuine rather than merely professional. "Ladies," he said in German that had American accent, but was clear enough, "you look very nice. The theater is about 3 miles from here. We'll drive you in the truck, and I need to explain the rules before we arrive." The rules were simple. Stay with the group. Don't attempt to leave the theater or make contact with civilians beyond basic politeness. Don't discuss the war or politics with anyone. Sit where directed. If there's any problem, report it to guards immediately, rather than trying to handle it yourself. The women nodded, understanding these were reasonable security precautions rather than unnecessary restrictions. They climbed into the back of a military truck, sitting on bench seats, feeling strange in civilian dresses while riding in vehicle marked with U.S. Army insignia. The drive to town was short. Hearn, Texas revealed itself as a small town, maybe 5,000 people, a main street with shops, and a church and the Rialto Theater that dominated the block with its marquee and Art Deco facade. The evening was settling into dusk, streetlights beginning to glow, civilians moving between stores and restaurants, and the theater itself. The truck stopped a block from the Rialto. Miller and his guards helped the women down, and they walked as a group toward the theater. 12 German prisoners in borrowed dresses escorted by 4 American soldiers, with sidearms visible but not prominently displayed. People on the street watched, some with curiosity, some with hostility, most with the peculiar mix of both that defined American attitudes toward German prisoners. A man outside the hardware store spat as they passed. A woman with 2 children pulled them closer, protective instinct overriding any rational assessment of threat from a dozen escorted female prisoners. but others nodded greeting, acknowledging their presence, the way small-town people acknowledge anyone walking down their main street, enemy or not. The Rialto's box office was manned by a teenage girl who looked nervous when the group approached. Miller bought tickets paying with American money. Greta noticed, not using some separate prisoner voucher system. Regular tickets, regular price, as if the German women were just regular patrons whose money was as good as anyone else's. Inside, the lobby smelled of popcorn and candy, of the particular sweetness that came from American abundance corn and sugar and butter, luxuries that had vanished from German markets years ago. The concession stand was operational, selling treats that made Greta's mouth water just looking at them. Miller asked if any of the women wanted concessions, and when they hesitated, he bought popcorn to share. Casual generosity that made the experience feel less like supervised prisoner recreation and more like actual social outing. The theater interior was beautiful. Not grand like major city cinemas, but well-maintained and comfortable, with velvet seats and Art Deco fixtures that had been installed during better economic times and maintained despite war rationing. The walls were painted in shades of red and gold, and the curtain covering the screen was heavy fabric that looked expensive and proper. Miller directed the women to seats in the back row security decision. Greta understood, keeping prisoners where guards could watch both them and the rest of the audience. The American guards took positions at the row's ends, visible but not intrusive, present but not dominating. The theater was about half full. Civilians sat scattered through the seats, couples on dates, families with children, groups of young people talking and laughing with the easy comfort of those who had never known bombing or invasion. Some looked back at the German women with curiosity or hostility. Most didn't look at all, focused on their own conversations or on the anticipation of the movie itself. Greta sat between Ilse and Anna, feeling the velvet seat beneath her, smelling popcorn and perfume, and the particular scent of a crowd of people gathered for entertainment. She had been in theaters before in Hamburg, before the war, when movies were a regular part of social life rather than propaganda tools. But this felt different, foreign, American in ways she couldn't quite articulate, but could definitely feel. The lights dimmed, the audience quieted. The curtain opened to reveal the screen, and after a moment of darkness, the newsreel began. American newsreels were different from German ones. Less overtly propagandistic, though still clearly designed to support national war effort. The footage showed American factories producing equipment, American soldiers training, American ships at sea. The narration was confident, but not hysterical, presenting information rather than screaming ideology. Then came footage from Europe-Allied advances, German positions being overrun, prisoners being processed in numbers that made Greta's breath catch. The newsreel showed German defeat without glorying in it exactly, but without minimizing it either. This was the reality that propaganda had hidden from German civilians, the truth about how badly the war was going, evidence that everything the regime had promised about inevitable victory was lies. Greta felt tears on her face and couldn't stop them. She was watching her nation's defeat in an American theater, surrounded by enemies who were eating popcorn, and watching German soldiers surrender in numbers that meant the war was effectively over, even if the fighting hadn't officially stopped. The humiliation was crushing, not because the Americans were cruel, but because the truth was undeniable when presented as footage rather than as propaganda claims she could question. Ilse reached over and took her hand, squeezed it without speaking. Ilse was crying too, silently, tears running down her face as she watched German forces collapse on screen. They weren't crying from fear of American treatment that had been consistently fair. They were crying from grief for Germany, for what the regime had done to their nation, for the lies that had led to this catastrophic defeat. The newsreel ended. The feature film began, Casablanca, which had been released in 1942, but was still playing in small-town theaters for audiences who came for the story rather than for novelty. The opening credits rolled, and Greta tried to focus on the screen rather than on her own emotions. The film was in English with no subtitles, but Greta had learned enough English during Captivity to follow basic plot. Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman, a love story set against wartime. Refugees fleeing across Africa, moral choices about resistance and collaboration, and what people owed to causes larger than themselves. The irony wasn't lost on Greta. She was watching a film about resistance to the regime, about choosing principle over safety, while sitting as a prisoner of forces that were fighting against that regime. The Americans in the theater were rooting for the resistance, for the characters who helped refugees escape, for the defeat of German occupation forces that the film presented as villains. And they were right. That was the devastating part. The film's portrayal of German forces as oppressors wasn't propaganda, it was accurate. The regime had occupied nations, had persecuted civilians, had committed acts that Greta was only beginning to understand the full scope of through carefully managed information from American authorities. She watched Rick Blaine make his choice, watched him sacrifice personal happiness to support the resistance, watched him acknowledge that some things mattered more than individual comfort. The audience applauded at the end, at the famous final scene where Rick and Louis walk into the fog, discussing the beginning of a beautiful friendship. The lights came up. The audience began filing out, talking about the movie, laughing and gossiping, and living their ordinary lives. The German women sat for a moment longer, processing what they had seen, trying to reconcile entertainment with the uncomfortable truths embedded in what had been presented as mere movie. Outside the theater, the Texas evening had cooled to merely hot rather than oppressive. The street was quiet except for people leaving the theater, dispersing toward homes and cars, and the continuation of lives that had been only briefly interrupted by 2 hours of cinematic story. Miller gathered the women, checked that everyone was present, and began walking them back toward the truck. Greta felt strange, disoriented, emotionally drained, unsure how to integrate what she had experienced into understanding of her situation and Germany's fate. A woman stopped them on the sidewalk. She was maybe 40, well-dressed, carrying a purse that looked expensive. She looked at the German women, at their borrowed dresses and escorted status, and said something in English that Miller translated. She says she hopes you enjoyed the movie. She says she knows it must be difficult being far from home, and she's glad the authorities are treating you decently. Greta tried to respond in broken English. Thank you. We are ... grateful. The movie was good. The woman smiled, nodded, and continued on her way. It was a small interaction, barely significant, but it represented something larger. American civilians acknowledging German prisoners as humans worthy of basic courtesy, enemies perhaps but not monsters, captives but not objects of pure hatred. Back at the camp, the women gathered in their common area to discuss what they had experienced. The other prisoners, those who hadn't been selected for the movie outing, wanted to know everything. What was the theater like? What did civilians say? Was the movie good? Were the Americans hostile? Greta tried to explain, struggled to convey the complexity of the experience. The movie itself had been entertaining. The civilians had been mostly indifferent, occasionally hostile, sometimes unexpectedly kind. The whole experience had been surreal, sitting in a theater, watching entertainment while their nation collapsed, being treated like regular people by enemies who had every right to treat them harshly. Marguerite raised the question that everyone was thinking. Why do they do this? Why give us movies and decent food and civilian clothes for evening? What do they gain from treating us so well? Anna had been quiet since returning, but now she spoke. They gain our understanding that the propaganda was lies. Every time they treat us fairly, every time they show us American life continuing normally while Germany burns, every time they prove they're not the monsters we were told they were, they win. Not militarily, but morally. They prove that their system is better than ours, that their values are more humane, that everything the regime taught us was backwards. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. Anna had articulated what they had all been feeling, but hadn't wanted to say explicitly. The fair treatment wasn't just following international law, it was demonstration of systemic superiority, proof that American democracy, however imperfect, was better than German dictatorship at basic task of treating humans with dignity. The next movie night came 2 weeks later. Different women were selected to camp, rotated privileges to ensure fairness. But Greta and several others from the first group were included again, reward for good behavior and recognition that they had handled the previous outing appropriately. This time, the film was Going My Way, a Bing Crosby musical about a priest helping troubled youth. Lighter fare than Casablanca, less politically charged, just entertainment about an American community solving problems through cooperation and good-natured humor. But even this was political, in its way showing American civilian life as functional and optimistic, people working together rather than being forced together, communities maintained through voluntary cooperation rather than through authoritarian control. Greta watched and tried to remember when German films had last shown such optimism, such faith that problems could be solved without violence or coercion. She couldn't remember. German cinema under the regime had been propaganda or escapist fantasy, never honest portrayal of community function or genuine exploration of human goodness. The summer progressed. Movie nights became regular routine every 2 weeks, groups of prisoners taken to the Rialto, watching whatever happened to be playing, experiencing American culture through Hollywood's lens. The films varied: comedies, musicals, westerns, war pictures, though the camp administrators carefully selected war films that weren't too overtly anti-German. Each outing reinforced the same lessons: American abundance, American normalcy, American capacity to maintain civilian life despite war that consumed unprecedented resources. By September, the novelty had worn off enough that the experience felt almost normal. Greta put on her borrowed dress, rode the truck to town, sat in the theater, watched movies, interacted briefly with civilians, and returned to camp without the intense emotional reaction that had characterized early experiences. The cognitive dissonance remained, but had dulled to background noise. Yes, she was a prisoner watching movies while Germany collapsed, but that was simply the situation, and denying herself the experience wouldn't change Germany's fate. She wrote to her family letters that went through multiple layers of censorship before being sent across an Atlantic where U-boats no longer threatened because German naval capacity had been destroyed. She told them she was well treated, that American captivity was nothing like propaganda had predicted, that she hoped they were safe, and that the war would end soon so they could all begin rebuilding. Her family's response, when it finally arrived months later, was guarded. They were surviving, though Hamburg had been bombed heavily and their apartment building was damaged. They were glad she was safe. They didn't mention the regime or the war's progress, either because censors would remove such comments or because even in private correspondence, years of training made explicit criticism dangerous. By winter, the movie outings had become established program. New prisoners arriving at camp. Hearn heard about movie privileges and were told that good behavior earned recreational opportunities. The Germans organized themselves to maintain camp discipline, understanding that privileges could be revoked if problems arose, preferring cooperation with American authorities over resistance that would only make their captivity more difficult. Christmas brought special privileges. The women were allowed to attend a church service in town, supervised by guards, but otherwise permitted to worship alongside American civilians. Then came a special movie showing It's a Wonderful Life, a film about small-town American life and the value of individual human existence, themes that felt pointed given recent revelations about the regime's systematic devaluation of certain lives. Greta watched James Stewart realize his importance to his community, watched the ending where the entire town rallied to help him, and felt tears she couldn't quite explain. This was propaganda too, in its way showing American society as fundamentally good, as built on networks of mutual support rather than on hierarchies of power. But it was also genuinely moving, genuinely beautiful. A vision of how communities could function when people chose cooperation over domination. By spring 1945, the war in Europe was ending. News filtered through the camp German forces collapsing on all fronts. American and Soviet forces meeting in the middle of what had been German territory. The regime's leadership dead or captured or fled. Germany had surrendered unconditionally, and the fighting was finally over. The women in Camp Hearn received the news with mixed emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped. Grief for what Germany had lost and become. Fear about what would happen to their families in occupied territory. Uncertainty about their own futures. Would they be repatriated? When? To what kind of Germany? The movie outings continued even after surrender. If anything, they became more frequent. American authorities seemed to recognize that the transition from war to peace required maintaining prisoner morale, that Germans facing return to devastated homeland needed whatever small comforts could be provided. In June, the Rialto showed newsreels from Germany footage of liberated areas, of destruction scale, of civilians emerging from rubble, of systematic crimes that had been hidden from most Germans, but were now being documented in detail. The footage was devastating not just because of destruction, but because of revelations about what the regime had done, about systematic persecution that went far beyond what Greta had known or imagined. She watched civilians being shown the camps where persecution had occurred, watched their shocked faces and denials that they had known, watched American soldiers forcing German civilians to confront what had been done in their name. And she understood that every German would face this reckoning, that ignorance would not be accepted as excuse, that claiming "we didn't know" would not absolve complicity. The movie that followed the newsreel was some comedy she couldn't focus on. She sat in the velvet seat while American civilians around her laughed at screen antics, and she thought about what she would face upon return, not just material, rebuilding, but moral reckoning, confronting what her nation had done, accepting responsibility for having served even in limited medical capacity. After the movie, walking back to the truck, an elderly American man stopped their group. He spoke directly to Greta in heavily accented German. "I was born in Germany, left in 1890, came to Texas and made a good life. I hope you young women can do the same, learn from what happened, help rebuild something better, make Germany what it should have been instead of what it became." Greta thanked him, though the words felt inadequate. But she understood what he was offering, not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that individuals could change, that Germany could be rebuilt on better foundations, that the future didn't have to be determined by the past. The summer brought news of their repatriation. The women would return to Germany in September, would be processed through displacement camps, would eventually make their way to whatever remained of their hometowns and families. The prospect was both longed for and frightening. They wanted to go home, but home no longer existed as they remembered it. The final movie night came in August. The film was The Best Years of Our Lives, a story about American soldiers returning home from war, struggling to reintegrate into civilian life, dealing with wounds both visible and invisible. Greta watched and saw her own future, not the American version exactly, but the universal struggle of veterans trying to build peaceful lives after experiencing war's disruptions. The movie acknowledged that return was difficult, that war changed people, that healing would take time. But it also showed that healing was possible, that communities could welcome veterans home, that life could be rebuilt even after terrible experiences. The message was hopeful without being naive, realistic about challenges, while insisting on possibility of recovery. Walking out of the Rialto for the last time, Greta looked at the marquee, at the lights spelling out the movie's title, at the ordinary Texas town going about its ordinary business. She tried to memorize the moment, not because it had been particularly happy, but because it represented something important about what she had learned during captivity. The movies had been propaganda, yes, Every film had reinforced messages about American values and German errors. But they had also been genuine art, genuine entertainment, genuine windows into a society that functioned differently from what she had known. And the fact that American authorities had allowed German prisoners to experience this, had given them access to culture and recreation, had treated them as humans worthy of small pleasures, that said more about American values than any explicit propaganda could have communicated. Greta Hoffmann returned to Germany in September 1945, to a Hamburg that was barely recognizable. Her family had survived, though their apartment building was rubble, and they lived in a displaced persons camp. Her father had been in the regular army, not implicated in war crimes, but he was dead, not from combat, but from illness during the collapse's chaos. She found work quickly. Nurses were desperately needed for rebuilding efforts. She treated civilians, helped with public health initiatives, used skills she had learned in military service for constructive purposes rather than supporting military operations. The work was hard, the conditions difficult, but it was honest labor aimed at healing rather than at enabling further violence. She talked about her captivity when people asked, about the fair treatment, the adequate food, the medical work she had been allowed to continue, and about the movies, the surreal experience of being taken to a Texas theater, watching Hollywood films, being treated like a regular person rather than like a defeated enemy. Some people didn't believe her, claimed she was exaggerating American kindness or minimizing what must have been harsh treatment. Others understood immediately, recognized that American capacity for basic decency toward prisoners said important things about the SO, differences between democratic and authoritarian systems. She kept one possession from captivity, a movie ticket stub, saved from that first night at the Rialto, kept in a small box with other mementos from her life. She looked at it, occasionally faded paper, barely legible text admission to Casablanca on a July evening in 1944, and remembered what it had felt like to sit in that theater, wearing a borrowed dress, watching American entertainment while her world collapsed. The experience had changed her in ways she was still discovering years later. Not just the fair treatment, though that mattered, but the demonstration that enemies could show mercy, that captivity didn't require cruelty, that humans could maintain ethics even during war's worst moments. The regime had taught her that power required brutality, that showing mercy was weakness, that enemies deserved only destruction. America had proved all of that false through simple act of letting German nurses watch movies in a small-town Texas theater. She married an American soldier in 1952, a medic she had met when he was stationed in Hamburg during occupation. They immigrated to the United States in 1953, settled in Texas, not near Camp Hearn, but close enough that she could visit occasionally, could drive past the camp that was being converted to other uses, could see the Rialto Theater that still stood on Main Street in Hearn, though it was showing different movies to different audiences. She told her children about the war, about captivity, about the strange kindness of being taken to movies while prisoner. She explained that mercy wasn't weakness, that treating enemies fairly was strength, that the capacity to maintain humanity during war was what separated good societies from failed ones. Her children grew up understanding that their German mother had learned about American values while imprisoned in Texas, that movie tickets represented more than entertainment. They represented a nation's commitment to decency, even toward those it had every reason to hate. In 1985, on a trip to Texas, Greta visited the Rialto one more time. The theater had been restored, was now showing classic films for nostalgia audiences rather than current releases. She bought a ticket paying with her own American money this time, not as a prisoner but as a citizen, and watched Casablanca again, 4 decades after that first viewing. She cried during the ending, just as she had cried the first time. But the tears meant different things now. Not grief for Germany's defeat, but gratitude for the mercy shown by enemies, who had become friends for the unexpected kindness that had helped her survive, and rebuild for the proof that humans could choose compassion over hatred, even across the deepest divides of war and ideology. The movie ended. The credits rolled. The audience applauded. And Greta sat in the velvet seat in a Texas theater and remembered a summer when German nurses had been given the impossible gift of normalcy, when prisoners had been allowed to pretend they were free, when enemies had shown mercy not because they had to, but because they chose to see captured women as humans, worthy of small pleasures even during war's darkest days. The experience had saved her in ways that went beyond physical survival. It had shown her that the future didn't have to replicate the past, that mercy was possible, that humans could choose to build something better than hatred and violence. The movie tickets had been propaganda, yes, but they had also been grace, unexpected and unearned, proof that even during war, humanity could persist if people chose to maintain it.